The shells appeared first, not one or two, hundreds of them, scattered across the mudflat, like the aftermath of something violent and methodical. Maya Jensen noticed them on a Tuesday morning in late October 2022, in the lower reaches of the Willapa Bay estuary on Washington state's southwestern coast. She had waited out before dawn, chest waders fogged with cold breath, to pull her juvenile Dungeness crab monitoring traps from the channels between the eelgrass beds. The traps were supposed to tell her how the Dungeness juveniles were faring. They told her something else entirely. Every single trap was packed not with small Dungeness crabs, but with European green crabs. Dozens of them, their olive and yellow mottled shells clattering against the wire mesh. She had expected to find some, not this many. In a single morning, she pulled nearly 400 green crabs from an area of estuary she could jog across in under a minute. But it wasn't the traps that stopped her cold. It was the shoreline. Beneath a drift log at the marsh edge lay a pile of broken carapaces, green crab shells, cracked and hollowed, legs wrenched free, fresh. She kept walking and kept finding them. Shell fragments in pickleweed roots, a half-eaten crab wedged into a boulder crack, shallow scrapes in the silt, as if something had been digging. Something was eating the invaders, and nobody had thought to ask what. To understand what Maya found that morning, you have to understand what Willapa Bay is, and what it has been. For the indigenous Shoalwater Bay tribe, these waters were not simply geography. They were a food system, a spiritual landscape, a home refined over thousands of years. The bay's shellfish beds supported entire communities long before European contact. The Chinook peoples developed intricate relationships with the tidal rhythms of the bay, knowing when to harvest, where to harvest, and how to leave enough behind for the beds to regenerate. Knowledge accumulated across generations, stretching back at least 10,000 years. By the late 1800s, Willapa Bay's oyster fishery had become one of the most commercially significant on the Pacific coast. Native oysters were harvested to near extinction by 1900, replaced by Pacific oysters transplanted from Japan. Then came Spartina grass, an invasive cordgrass that choked tidal flats for decades. Then came warming waters. Then came acidification that made it harder for oyster larvae to form shells. And then, in the early 2000s, came the green crab. European green crabs, Carcinus mayanas, are not particularly large. An adult spans perhaps 3 inches across the carapace. Place one in your palm and it feels trivial. But the International Union for Conservation of Nature lists it among the world's 100 worst invasive species, and that designation is not ceremonial. In its native Atlantic range, the green crab sits inside a food web that evolved alongside it across millions of years, constrained by predators, parasites, and a system built to absorb its appetite. On the Pacific coast of North America, none of that exists. The first confirmed Pacific Coast population was detected in San Francisco Bay in 1989, almost certainly arriving in ballast water or Atlantic shellfish shipments. By the late 1990s, green crabs had spread to Oregon. By 2020, they had reached southern British Columbia. Then, in 2020 and 2021, population surveys at places like Dungeness Spit and Haida Gwaii recorded densities that stunned researchers. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands per survey site. In some Washington estuaries, a single tides trap survey captured over 4,000 individuals. The timing mattered. A series of unusually warm Pacific Ocean conditions, beginning around 2014, had raised coastal water temperatures enough to dramatically improve green crab larval survival. Their planktonic larvae, capable of drifting for 4 to 8 weeks on ocean currents, could now travel farther and settle into habitats that had previously been too cold. Climate change was effectively rolling out a red carpet. The ecological consequences arrived quickly. Green crabs are generalist predators with an extraordinary capacity for destruction per unit of body mass. They do not simply eat shellfish. They actively pursue and dismember prey, often consuming only part of a clam before discarding it and pursuing another. In Atlantic Canada, where they have been present since at least the 1950s, soft-shell clam populations in heavily invaded estuaries fell by up to 90%. In the maritime provinces, the economic toll reached tens of millions of dollars annually through the 1990s and 2000s, devastating fishing communities that had operated the same way for 200 years. On the Pacific coast, the stakes were measured in different currency. Washington State's Pacific razor clam fishery, worth roughly $20 million annually, depended on the same sandy estuarine flats green crabs were now excavating. The Dungeness crab fishery, the most valuable single-species fishery on the West Coast, generating over $200 million per year, relied on eelgrass meadows as nursery habitat for juveniles. Green crabs didn't merely eat those juveniles. They physically dismantled the eelgrass beds, uprooting shoots while foraging and degrading the habitat that nursery species required. A single green crab can excavate a square meter of eelgrass per day. Governments responded with emergency funding, intensive trapping programs, and rapid response monitoring. Tribes along the coast, the Makah, the Quinault, the Huayot First Nations, deployed their own removal efforts, understanding the invasion threatened not just commercial fisheries, but connections to the land that could not be valued in dollars. By 2023, Washington alone had removed over 400,000 green crabs. British Columbia extracted tens of thousands more. The removal was real, the effort was genuine, and the population kept expanding. Which is where Maya Jensen's broken shells began to matter. She reported her observations to her supervisor and submitted a field note to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Nobody dismissed her, but nobody initially had an answer. The obvious candidates were examined first. River otters had been observed on the estuary before. Could they be the culprit? She set a wildlife camera facing the drift log. Within 4 days, she had footage. A river otter arriving at low tide, digging into the mud, pulling out a green crab, carrying it to the log, and systematically breaking it apart. It returned 6 times in a single low-tide sequence. It was not the first such observation. Research from 2004 by Nova Scotia researchers had documented river otters incorporating green crabs into their diet in heavily invaded estuaries, noting that individual otters appeared to develop what the authors called crab foraging specialization, a learned feeding preference being passed between individuals in the same group. The paper had not made headlines. It had not been widely cited in Pacific Northwest management discussions. It had, in a sense, been waiting. Maya found it at 2 in the morning with a cup of cold coffee. She forwarded it to Dr. Sylvia Behrens-Yamada at Oregon State University, who had been tracking Pacific Coast green crab populations for years. Yamada's response arrived the next morning. She had been seeing something similar, and she was already asking the same questions. What followed was not a single discovery. It was more like a series of small lenses being brought into alignment until something distant suddenly came into focus. Camera trap data from multiple estuary sites across Washington and Oregon, compiled between 2021 and 2024, began revealing a pattern no single site could have shown alone. Great blue herons were foraging on green crabs in the low marsh channels. Not extraordinarily, since herons eat crabs, but at frequencies higher than pre-invasion baselines predicted. In sites with high green crab density, heron foraging bout duration increased significantly. They were lingering. They were finding more food than expected. Glaucous-winged gulls were dropping crabs onto rocky outcrops to break them, a known behavior, now applied to an unfamiliar prey. Surf scoters and bufflehead ducks were documented consuming small green crabs in shallow flats. A 2023 stable isotope study from the University of Washington found green crab-derived carbon signatures in the tissue of multiple shorebird and waterfowl species, suggesting regular, not incidental consumption. And then there were the native crabs. Red rock crabs and Dungeness crabs had always consumed small invertebrates in Pacific coast estuaries. But field surveys beginning in 2022 documented a measurable uptick in native crab predation on small and freshly molted green crabs, the latter being particularly vulnerable, as a green crab immediately after molting is essentially defenseless for several hours. A 2023 study in biological invasions demonstrated that Dungeness crabs actively preyed on recently molted green crabs at rates high enough to potentially suppress juvenile survival in localized habitats. No single predator was making a dent in the overall invasion, but the predators were multiplying in their diversity. This is where the story changes shape. The first instinct, watching these data points accumulate, is to reach for a familiar narrative: nature fighting back, a hero species emerging to check the invader. It is a compelling story because it has happened before. The recovery of sea otter populations along parts of the Pacific coast demonstrably suppressed sea urchins and allowed kelp forests to recover. But the European green crab story was not that story. There was no single species rising to restore a previous equilibrium. There were many species, across many feeding guilds and life histories, independently making the same ecological choice. Dr. Yamada described it during a 2024 presentation at Oregon State as something closer to a distributed learning problem. Each predator species, each river otter group, each heron pair, was independently encountering an abundant, energy-rich prey item and independently learning to exploit it. The learning was not coordinated. It was convergent. Ecologists call this process prey switching. When a new prey species becomes sufficiently abundant, predators begin encountering it frequently enough that it crosses a threshold of profitability and shift their effort toward it. The shift is not driven by intelligence or strategy. It is driven by energy economics. Green crabs, now saturating these estuaries, had crossed that threshold for a growing number of native species simultaneously. The result was something not written into any management plan. In a healthy pre-invasion estuary, a river otter's caloric intake came primarily from native fish, eels, and crabs. Now a portion of that energy budget was being met by green crabs. The food web had acquired a new pathway, one that ran directly through an invasive species and back into the bodies of native wildlife. This did not mean the invasion was being neutralized. Green crab populations remained at levels scientists described, with some understatement, as alarming. Eelgrass bed destruction continued. Shellfish surveys in heavily invaded portions of Willapa Bay showed ongoing suppression of native clam recruitment. The razor clam fishery remained under pressure. The economic impact was real and ongoing, measured in lost harvests, emergency management costs, and tribal restoration teams pulling traps 6 days a week from water growing colder as autumn deepened. But the pattern suggested something management models had not fully incorporated. In sites where native predator diversity was highest, river otters, herons, sea ducks, native crabs, and bottom-dwelling fish all co-occurring in healthy numbers, green crab density was measurably lower than in degraded sites with fewer predator species. The difference was not dramatic. It was not a solution, but it was a signal. The harder question, the one that does not resolve cleanly, is what to do with that signal. Governments are spending millions annually on trapping programs that remove real numbers of crabs, but cannot, by themselves, reverse the invasion. Washington spent approximately $3 million on green crab response in fiscal year 2023 alone. Meanwhile, river otters remove green crabs around the clock, at no cost, in every estuary they inhabit. The contrast is not a reason to cancel trapping programs. Those matter, particularly for protecting specific shellfish beds and eelgrass restoration sites. But it asks a question coastal management has not fully answered. What if the most cost-effective long-term strategy is not maximum suppression effort, but maximum native ecosystem health? An estuary with dense native predator populations, intact eelgrass beds, and clean, cold water is not one in which green crabs thrive unchecked. Degraded estuaries, silted, warmed, stripped of native species, are exactly the habitat where green crabs reach explosive densities. The invasion is not separate from habitat degradation. It is, in part, an expression of it. The tribes understand this with a clarity that formal management sometimes misses. The Shoalwater Bay Tribe's restoration program in Willapa Bay is organized not around green crabs, but around eelgrass, water quality, and shellfish beds. The reasoning is not naive. It is increasingly supported by comparative estuary data. The healthier the ecosystem, the more resilient it is to the invasion. Not immune. Resilient. In the winter of 2024, Maya Jensen submitted a summary of her observation data and camera trap records to a regional research consortium working on Pacific Coast green crab ecology. She was not the lead researcher, she was a field technician who spent her days in chest waders pulling traps. But the drift log where she had first found the broken shells had become a permanent camera station, one of 11 distributed across the estuary, feeding data into a monitoring network mapping, for the first time, the full predator-prey dynamics of the invaded system. The footage accumulated across 2 years of tidal cycles contains thousands of predation events. River otters foraging before dawn, a great blue heron striking into a tidal pool with mechanical precision and walking away with a struggling green crab in its bill. A red rock crab pinning a freshly molted green crab to the substrate and methodically consuming it over 40 minutes. A surf scoter surfacing from a shallow channel with a small green crab, tilting its head to swallow. None of these images will save Willapa Bay. None will restore the eelgrass beds already lost, or return the soft shell clam densities that existed before the crabs arrived. The invasion is real, its consequences are real, and the communities, human and ecological alike, that depend on these estuaries are absorbing losses that cannot be undone on any timeline that feels remotely acceptable. But the footage contains something the original invasion models did not predict: evidence of an ecosystem that is not simply being overwritten. It is responding, slowly, imperfectly, through the unsupervised daily decisions of hundreds of individual animals, reaching toward a new configuration in which the invader is not expelled but absorbed. Whether that absorption can happen fast enough to protect what remains of the shellfish beds, the eelgrass meadows, and the tribal harvesting practices that have defined this coast for 10,000 years is a question without an answer yet. What the cameras show is not a story about winning or losing. It is a story about a living system doing what living systems do, finding the next pathway forward through a changed world, one small feeding decision at a time, in the cold, dark water of a Pacific Northwest estuary at low tide. If the natural world's capacity to adapt in the face of ecological disruption is something you want to understand more deeply, the investigations happening along the Pacific Northwest coast are just one piece of a much larger story unfolding across every continent and ocean on Earth. By researchers and technicians and tribal harvesters who wake up before dawn and pull traps from the cold water, and who occasionally find something that changes what we thought we knew.